Welcome back to CBS Sports HQ. Ryan Wilson's latest mock draft is up over on CBSSports.com. Here are the players from both Georgia and TCU that could be drafted in those first 32 picks. Top of the board, Georgia defensive lineman Jalen Carter, the first of 4 Georgia players Ryan has going in the opening round. For TCU, wide receiver Quentin Johnson is their only first-round inclusion for Ryan for now. Let's discuss these first-round players with the mock draft maven himself, Ryan Wilson, joining us. Ryan, let's start with Quentin Johnson, who pulled a little Houdini in the Natty last night and just disappeared. Just 1 reception for 3 yards. Versus Michigan, he was huge. 6 receptions, 163 yards and a touchdown. How much does a performance like what happened last night affect his draft stock, or do you just put it down to being game planned out against a much better team?
It's not going to affect his draft stock at all, Jeremy, because to your point, there are a lot of factors that weighed in on the way that football game unfolded. Forget 4 quarters over the first 30 minutes of football. And there were opportunities. I went back and watched every snap this morning. Offensively, TCU had exactly 52 snaps. That is extremely low for a college football team, usually get in the 70s, sometimes 80s. And the fact that they were doing a lot of 3-and-outs, the fact that Max Duggan struggled with turnovers, the fact that the front 4 for Georgia got after Max Duggan consistently, that all played a part in why Quentin Johnson ended the evening 1 catch for 3 yards, which came in the first half on a quick screen. There were opportunities when you go back and watch where he had one at the line of scrimmage and he was open, just that Max Duggan didn't have time to get him the ball. And on Max Duggan's first interception, Quentin Johnson was wide open on a post that probably would have scored for a 60, 70-yard touchdown. And Duggan, again, was under pressure, so he didn't have an opportunity to set his feet and make a throw. The ball ended up being intercepted on a great play by the Georgia defender. So at the end of the day, I think this is one of those games that you just, you hear coaches say it all the time. We ain't watching the tape on this. Do not watch the tape on this if you're a Quentin Johnson fan. I think NFL teams will look at the body of his work over the course of his career. Most recently, as you know, last week's performance, and he will end up being a top 15 pick. And probably the first wide receiver off the board. He is my wide receiver 1, but he'll have a little competition, most likely from USC's Jordan Addison. But I'm not going to put any stock in this, and I'm sure that Quentin Johnson is, to paraphrase Bill Belichick, he is on to Cincinnati, and Cincinnati for him is the pre-draft process. 60 receptions, just over 1,000 yards receiving, 6 touchdowns for him as he finishes off the season. And you have him going number 9 to the Carolina Panthers. All right, the top guy on your board is defensive lineman Jalen Carter, who you described as a layup selection for the Bears. But Ryan, how confident are you that the Bears would take him at 1? 0. That's how confident I am, Jeremy. And I say that not because the Bears don't need a player like Jalen Carter, because they certainly could use someone in the middle of that defense clogging up holes, or even a Will Anderson out of Alabama, who will probably be a top 3 selection as well. But more importantly, because this draft class, unlike last year's draft class, is going to be deep at quarterback, especially at the top, and teams are going to be willing to move up to get that quarterback that they may love, whether it's a Bryce Young, a Will Levis, Anthony Richardson, C.J. Stroud. And the Bears, by virtue of what happened in Week 18 with that improbable Texans win over the Colts, have the first overall pick, and they will certainly be entertaining offers, I would imagine. We heard Chris Ballard, the Colts GM, say today that they are not afraid to trade up if they need to get a quarterback, so they could be in the conversation depending on what they decide is their QB1. And I think this is best case scenario for Chicago, because if you do have to stay put and you're not settling for Jalen Carter or even a Will Anderson, you're winning with that pick. But if you're able to move down even to 4 or 5, you can probably have an opportunity to still get a Jalen Carter, accumulate some draft picks, get some offensive line help for Justin Fields, which I'm sure is at the top of his to-do list this offseason, and then regroup and go into next season with higher hopes, and certainly how things played out this year for the Chicago Bears.
And it's not to say that they wouldn't end up with Carter. It's just they're probably just not going to end up with him at 1, if what you're saying is true. A lot of people expecting Chicago to move from the number 1 pick. Carter finishes the season, by the way, 16 tackles, 3 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and a second national title ring. Next up, a guy we haven't really talked about that much, tackle Broderick Jones. You have New England using a first-round pick on him. What does he bring to the Hoodie and company?
A chance for Mac Jones to appreciate some protection. And that's what happened during Mac Jones' rookie season. It rarely happened in his second season, and there are any number of variables that explain why the Patriots struggled. Injuries along the offensive line was one of them. Obviously, Matt Patricia, as the play caller, drew some consideration as well. But I think what you get in Broderick Jones is an incredibly athletic left tackle. He played every snap this season. He played over 500 snaps last season at left tackle, so he has a little experience. Now, the athletic athleticism jumps off the screen. There's going to be some need for some technical work in terms of footwork and hand usage and the type of things that offensive line coaches get down and dirty in when they get with these prospects, and that'll be something you have to consider. And our guy Rick Spielman talked about this on the With the First Pick podcast that we do together, that he wouldn't feel comfortable throwing Broderick Jones out there, say, in week 1, but he's the guy that you draft and develop with the understanding that he's going to be a really good football player for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, but he's not quite certain if he's ready yet. And that's sort of the consensus you get when you talk to folks around the league as well. That doesn't mean he won't be a first-round pick, because sometimes these offensive linemen get pushed up draft boards. But I think that Broderick Jones' athleticism and the projectability in terms of being a really good football player down the line is going to see him go in round 1.
And if he goes to the Patriots, certainly addressing a need for them. Cornerback Keely Ringo goes 2 picks later in this first-round mock to the Commanders. Ohio State attacked him in that playoff semifinal. 13 targets thrown at him. What concerns you about Ringo at this point?
Well, I'll give him a lot of credit, because that's one of the things we were talking about before last night's national championship game. Would Keely Ringo be able to bounce back after a tough showing against Marvin Harrison Jr.? And look, there's no crime in not playing well against Marvin Harrison Jr. It happens to a lot of people who've had that task. But I will give Keely Ringo credit. He's big, he's strong, he's fast, he's good at the catch point. Sometimes he gets turned around. And again, you have to have a short memory as a cornerback. Last night, when he had the opportunity, he played a ton of press man against Quentin Johnson, and he won a lot of those reps. Now, we talked about why Quentin Johnson struggled to get the football. Part of that was the offense, part of that was the Georgia's overall defense, and some of that was Keely Ringo stepping up. So, is he my cornerback 1? No, he's not. I like Joey Porter Jr. a little better. He's another big, strong, athletic cornerback. But Keely Ringo is going to be a first-round pick for the reasons we just saw there on that video highlight. And as I mentioned, he's a big cornerback, and he is strong, and he can make plays at the point. Sometimes he'll get beat, but again, that's the life of an NFL cornerback, which he will certainly be. It's just a matter of how high does he end up going, and how much will teams value the physical attributes, even though it wasn't as consistent on tape as we saw perhaps from someone like a Derek Stingley Jr. last year, or certainly a Sauce Gardner, 2 of the first cornerbacks off the board a year ago.
Lastly, a guy we want to talk about who led the Bulldogs in receptions and yards last night, one of their top receiver over the course of the season, Brock Bowers, set to enter his junior season. Ryan, we all know this kid's story, from unknown recruit to 2 national titles in 2 years. Could this kid be one of the greatest diamonds in the rough of all time at this point?
So here's the thing I like to say about college football players who aren't yet eligible for the NFL draft. When he becomes eligible, should he decide to graduate from college, more power to Brock Bowers. But whenever he decides to come out, I will say this. He has an opportunity to be one of the best tight ends we've seen in a draft in quite some time. And maybe the only exception is Kyle Pitts, who went 4th overall to the Falcons currently. You see that right here. So I think there's a real chance that we see Kyle Pitts, and then we could see someone like Brock Bowers be a top 10 pick. So maybe he slots in there between Pitts and TJ Hockenson, who isn't the athlete that Brock Bowers is, but certainly is a very good football player. But you go back over the last 20 years of tight ends taken in the first round, and Brock Bowers is right behind Kyle Pitts in my mind in terms of athleticism, playmaking ability. He does just about everything you want, and that was on full display on Monday night, where he went for 7 catches for 152, I believe, and an incredible contested catch touchdown. The versatility jumps off the screen, the playmaking ability jumps off the screen, and the fact that he's a true sophomore gets your attention. Should he play 2 more years, Jeremy? More power to him, and when he comes out, we'll talk about it. But as I sit here, you're asking me a question, I'm going to answer it. This is a really good football player with a bright future.
Kid had to beg for an invitation to Nike Spark just to get noticed, and the rest, as they say, is history. Ryan Wilson's latest mock is available over on CBSSports.com. Great stuff as always, Ryan. Good to see you. Ryan and his podcast partner, former GM Rick Spielman, you heard Ryan talk about it. They're breaking down every pick in that mock draft over on their new podcast, With the First Pick. You can download and follow wherever you get your podcasts, or scan that QR code to listen right now.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.